call your name. Days get long, I call your name. Days get broken, set my spirit free. Oh, Lord, remember me.
Well, welcome to our Tuesday evening teaching sessions, and welcome to session 14, which of course is our final session on the book of Judges. We're looking tonight at Judges chapter 21. I guess if you're a bit of a film addict, you, like most people, enjoy the idea of a happy ending, or maybe that idea that the actors head off into the sunset and everything's beautiful and everything is resolved and it all kind of squares itself up. But of course, as you would expect, the book of Judges is absolutely nothing like that. It's been a book of surprises. It's been a book with much pain connected to the stories. Lots of questions have emerged out of what we've read, and I'm sure it requires a lifetime of trying to get to grips with what exactly the author intended when he penned these incredible stories. When we come to the end of the book of Judges, chapter 21, I guess it almost feels like, is that it? Is that all that's being said right at the end of 21 chapters? It has that feeling that it's not complete. In fact, it seems quite incomplete. And the questions that have been raised seem to be unresolved. And that's, of course, why it's part of a continuous ongoing story. And some of those questions will not be resolved until later on in the Old Testament. And some of them, of course, will not be resolved until the coming of Christ and all that Jesus meant for us. So what's the point of chapter 21? It doesn't seem unreasonable to ask that question. Well, let's see if we can gain some understanding and insight into it. Tonight, I'm going to read. It's the session 14, the last session on the book of Judges. So I've given David the night off, and I'm going to read for you. Judges chapter 21. The men of Israel had taken an oath at Mizpah. None of us will give his daughter in marriage to a Benjamite. The people went down to Bethel, where they sat before God until evening, raising their voices and weeping bitterly. "O Lord, the God of Israel," they cried, "why has this happened to Israel? Why should one tribe be missing from Israel today?" Early the next day, the people built an altar and presented burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Israelites asked, "Who from all the tribes of Israel has failed to assemble before the Lord?" For they had taken a solemn oath that anyone who failed to assemble before the Lord at Mizpah should certainly be put to death. Now the Israelites grieved for their brothers, the Benjamites. "Today one tribe is cut off from Israel," they said. "How can we provide wives for those who are left, since we have taken an oath by the Lord not to give any of our daughters in marriage?" Then they asked, "Which one of the tribes failed to assemble before the Lord at Mizpah?" They discovered that no one from Jabesh Gilead had come to the camp for the assembly. For when they counted the people, they found that none of the people of Jabesh Gilead were there. So the assembly sent 12,000 fighting men with instructions to go to Jabesh Gilead and put to sword those living there, including the women and children. "This is what you are to do," they said. "Kill every male and every woman who is not a virgin." They found among the people living in Jabesh Gilead 400 young women who had never slept with a man, and they took them to the camp at Shiloh in Canaan. Then the whole assembly sent an offer of peace to the Benjamites at the rock of Rimmon. So the Benjamites returned at that time and were given the women of Jabesh Gilead who had been spared. But there was not enough for all of them. The people grieved for Benjamin because the Lord had made a gap in the tribe of Israel. And the elders of the assembly said, with the women of Benjamin destroyed, how shall we provide wives for the men who are left? The Benjamite survivors must have heirs, they said, so that a tribe of Israel will not be wiped out. We can't give them our daughters as wives, since we Israelites have taken this oath. Cursed be anyone who gives a wife to a Benjamite. But look, there is an annual festival of the Lord in Shiloh, to the north of Bethel, and east of the road that goes from Bethel to Shechem, and south of Lebonah. So they instructed the Benjamites, saying, go and hide in the vineyards, and watch. When the girls of Shiloh come out to join in the dancing, then rush from the vineyards, and each of you seize a wife from the girls of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin. When their fathers or brothers complain to us, we will say to them, do us a kindness by helping them, because we did not get wives for them during the war, and you are innocents, since you did not give your daughters to them. So that is what the Benjamites did. When the girls were dancing, each man caught one and carried her off to be his wife. Then they returned to their inheritance and rebuilt the towns and settled in them. At that time, the Israelites left that place and went home to their own tribes and clans, each to its own inheritance. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he thought fit. Obviously, the tribes who had met together at Mizpah to really reconcile themselves to what had happened when they had received the mutilated, cut-up body of the concubine of the Levite. When they went there to try and find out, well, what was the cause behind all of this? Once they had discovered that, they had made some significant oaths. And one of them, following on from an act of revenge or retribution, was that no one from the 11 tribes, excluding Benjamin, were to allow the Benjamites to marry any of their daughters. It was a silly oath. It was made in the heat of the moment. It was an emotional response to a really terrible, terrible situation. The outcome of that oath would have significance for Israel as a whole. And of course, the outcome was that meant that the tribe of Benjamin would cease to exist. Following on from the massacre that had taken place, we're told that 600 Benjamite men survived. Of course, if they had no wives, then there would be no future. Right from the outset of the Exodus, Israel had always been 12 tribes. And even though in the Old Testament sometimes it becomes a little bit confusing about the names of each of those individual tribes, nonetheless, it always remained 12. It was in their DNA. It was what defined them as a nation. They were made up as a nation of 12 tribes. But of course now they had locked themselves into an oath. And how could that be reconciled? How could they bring about restitution after all the horrors and the massacres that had taken place? How could they bring healing so that the nation could become one nation again, made up of 12 tribes? Well, as I've already said, 600 Benjamites survived this massacre by fleeing from the battle scene. And of course, if they didn't have wives, then the outcome is obvious. There would only be, in the future, 11 tribes rather than 12. And so coming before the Lord with that sense of desperation, they ask a rhetorical question. Why has this happened to Israel? Well, where do we start? There are so many reasons why this situation has emerged, the reasons why this has happened. That the future seems to be 11 tribes rather than 12. Well, of course, inevitably, they try and find some way around this, some sort of solution. And what they do is that they refer to a second oath to get around the first oath. And the second oath made at Mizpah was that if any tribe or any town or any village had not attended the assembly when they gathered to decide what actions they were going to take in relation to the death of this, the tragic death of this concubine of the Levites, well, they had made a second oath. And again, it was another silly oath. But in this context, it seems to get them out of a difficult situation, because what they said was that any town or group or tribe or village that hadn't supported the assembly, well, they would be destroyed. And as they looked at it, as they examined the situation, as they made reference to those who had been at Mizpah, they discovered that it was the people of Jabesh Gilead who had failed to turn up. And this is how they're going to get around the problem of the first oath. They will dispatch 12,000 fighting men, and they will be sent to kill everyone, men, women, and children. They do that without a second thought, which again reflects the fact that this downward spiral has remained consistent throughout the whole book, and we never seem to reach the bottom of it. Every time one action or one consequence seems to lead us even further down into some kind of pit of darkness. Men, women, and children are to be slaughtered in Jabesh Gilead without a second thought. Of course, there would be some allowance made, and that allowance served their purpose. Those girls and young women in Jabesh Gilead who were still virgins, well, they would be saved, and they would be handed over as wives to the Benjamite survivors, the 600 men. One group is about to be sacrificed to save another group. It really, truly makes no sense. This downward spiral of actions and counteractions just seems to take us further and further away from those covenant promises that the people of Israel had made to God. But of course, the solution that they come up with is not enough, because there are only 400 wives available. There are 600 men. So 200 men still have no wives. It doesn't add up. It doesn't calculate. So what do we do now? Well, they have to find another solution. This time, the solution is kidnap. A festival to the Lord is going to be held in Shiloh, and it's suggested by the tribal leaders that the 200 men of Benjamin, who had no wives, well, they are to raid that festival unto the Lord. It's incredible, isn't it? This was a festival that was meant to reflect this incredible relationship between Israel and its God. It was to be joyful and celebratory, a thanksgiving offering. But here it is being misused again, being abused in every sense. They are to go, and when the girls come out to dance, they are to kidnap them. In doing that, there is no way that anyone from the 11 tribes could be accused of breaking their vows. They could console themselves that they had kept their oaths. But of course, the families of the girls inevitably would quite complain and ask questions. Why has this happened? What's going on? And of course, they then would try and reconcile the situation by simply saying, will you help us out? We're in a corner. We need you to support this, even though you've had no part in making the decision. It's a desperate situation. It's a problem that they should never have entered into. This is a problem they have made, and now they're trying to sort it out. Well, towards the end of the chapter, after all of that, we see that the tribes return to the land which has become their inheritance, each to their own area of land. Peace had come, it appears, but what a terrible price has been paid for what has taken place. And then the final verse, it's that repetitive statement that we've met before. It takes us back to the observations that the author has made previously. They have no human king to lead them, and neither do they have a divine king. They are not a monarchy, nor are they a theocracy. These were indeed dark, dark days. And of course, what the author is doing is trying to prepare us for the days ahead when Israel would become a monarchy. And occasionally, in those better times, a theocracy, a nation under the rule of God. What a journey we've been on with Judges. It's been a repetitive, at times, journey. We seem to have gone over the same cycle of events. It's always been a downward journey. To quote one of the books that I've used as I've prepared these talks, written by Michael Wilcock, he says, under a brisk coat of paint, the house rots and crumbles. The story of the first Levite that we met in chapter 17 and 18 showed us that even though all the paraphernalia of religious life continued, the heart of religion had long died. That sense of a covenant, intimate relationship with God had all but disappeared. The second Levite that we met showed us that the moral life of the nation had completely collapsed and sunk beneath the waves. The terrible moment when the concubine, the wife, is tragically killed and abused and mutilated. It's taken us into the reality of a society where the very moral fabric of the society has completely collapsed. And then we get this sense that even though the people at times seem to want to inquire of the Lord what to do, that actually what they're doing is they're only going through the motions. That time and time again, they're looking to themselves. They're doing what the author tells us. They're doing what is right in their own sight. And of course, proportional retribution or justice has completely gone out of the window. The response to the terrible, tragic death of this woman led to retribution completely out of proportion to the nature of events. The nation is split. It's divided. And even though it's returned now to its tribal areas, there is no sense of oneness or unity. There is no sense of God and his presence amongst them. And of course, the author is trying to warn us that when religion loses its heart, when morals collapse, when justice and proportionality is ignored, then a nation collapses under the weight of all of that. And we have clearly seen that in the book of Judges. The problem isn't that they don't have a king. As we see later on in the Old Testament, some of the kings proved to be good and some of them proved to be completely the opposite. They proved to be very bad in the way that they governed. The point is that everyone is doing what they think is right in their own eyes. And that has brought about the downfall of God's people, Israel, at this particular moment in time. If you look back to the closing chapters of the book of Joshua, the people make a pledge there. We will serve the Lord and we will obey him. But the book of Judges finishes with something like, we will serve ourselves and we will do what is right in our own eyes. And what is interesting, even though the book of Judges is so bleak and at points so dark, the next little book in the canon of Scripture is the book of Ruth. And that is, of course, set in the context of this period. And it's a book of hope. It's a book about a family who seek to do what is right. Not just right in their own eyes, but right in the sight of God. Even in this terrible time and in this context that is so dark and desperate, there remain good and righteous people who are seeking to do things God's way and are trying to be faithful to his covenant promises. I did warn you from the outset that this book wasn't family viewing. It's fit only to be viewed beyond the watershed. Maybe for some of you, it's proved to be even more shocking than you realized. It is meant to shock. It is meant to be sobering. It's meant to wake us up to the realities of how far God's people Israel strayed from their covenant promises. At times we've seen God acting, not according to some kind of model script, sometimes acting in completely unpredictable ways. At other times, God seems to be incredibly inactive, though he's waiting for the consequences of where the people are and how they're behaving and responding to hit home and bring his people to repentance. Well, can I suggest as an antidote to the book of Judges, if you need one, that you turn over a page and just read the lovely, beautiful story of Ruth. I think in the midst of the darkness, that brings some hope. And although the book of Judges is full of dark moments, desperate moments, we need to realize too that God is still there, and that provides hope and that provides light in the midst of the darkness. Thank you for engaging with these teaching sessions, and God bless you.
Remember me when these chains get broken, set my body free.